All right, welcome to Logic 101, where we talk about not much really about logic in the mathematical sense, like you might learn at a university. We're more focused on what logic means specifically in the context of building a web application with Sails.js as your framework on the back end and Vue as your framework on the front end. Okay, so at this point, you've built HTML in a Sails app. You've built web pages. You probably know a lot of this stuff, and this is going to somewhat feel like review, but I want to kind of peel a layer back and look at it from a theoretical perspective and try to make sure that we are all on the same page about what's really going on under the hood. So let's start by just making some HTML. So I'm going to take this home page here, and I'm going to gut it. So we'll say hello world. We'll take a look at that in the browser. So one of the first things that I want to look at here is what do we have, right? Like what's actually here included in the HTML. You can see that we have this ID. This is representing what page it is. That's kind of like a sales and parasales convention. This vcloak is a special way of telling Vue.js that we don't want this to display before all of the things inside of it. And then there's this other thing here, which we're going to come back to towards the end of this conversation about window.salesLocals. And you can see this is wrapped in these little %sign things, these EJS tags. And that is going to get evaluated on the server. Whereas the rest of this stuff makes it all the way to the client. This part actually gets swapped out with other stuff before it ever leaves the server, before this web page even gets to your browser. All right, so then we'll take a look at what's actually here in the browser. You can see there's no EJS tags, none of this %sign stuff. And you can see there's also a bunch of stuff that's gotten injected. And this is coming from the expose locals to browser right here. And then you can see the layout, the footer. This is some inline stuff from Bowser. Our scripts, the code that displays the unsupported browser overlay with some inline images, which is what this big crazy thing is. Okay, so that's our world we're living in right now. And in this world, we're used to seeing stuff like a simple H1 with some what I would call static content. This content is the same no matter what. This is always just hello world. So that's static. Now, if it was going to be dynamic, we might see something like that written out, where maybe it's like hello name. Now, if I try to refresh the browser, what's going to happen? It's going to show me an error because what the heck is name, right? So I could go into the page script and I could define name. And there's some stuff already here because on our default homepage, we manage the hero height and stuff because there's that animation. I'm going to wipe all this out so you can just see it nice and empty. All right, and I'm just going to set name. John, we're going to use your name. You're the new definition of cool. Hello, John Langston. Okay, so that's dynamic, right? When we say dynamic, that's what we're talking about. That's going to be at least potentially different. Now, it's not. It's hard-coded. It's static. This is static, hard-coded, kind of the same thing in this context. But this part, this is dynamic HTML. It can change. Now, there's 3 different ways to set these little variables here, to set this state, to set this data on the page. One way is from the back end, and that's what this sales locals thing is all about here. Another way is in the data at the top of your page script. Finally, the third way is here in the beforeMount function. Of course, you can always change it later on once the page is already loaded, but initially, those are the 3 places where data is going to be coming from. So let's try doing it the other way. I'm going to do this dot name equals John Langston. Just write some JavaScript here. I'll rip it out from up here. Refresh the page. Same results. The reason why I'm doing this dot name here is this is how you get access. Whereas in the HTML, I'm going to do curly's and then name, the name of the variable. Here, I'm going to do this dot name, where this refers to the VM or what Vue calls the VM, but the data, right? That's basically the data that's on the page. So this dot name equals John Langston is setting it, and then when the page mounts, that's provided and available. All right, so now let's do it the most kind of usual way that we see stuff like this get set, which is on the server. Clearing it out again, if I refresh right now, what would happen? Property or method name is not defined on the instance, but referenced during render. And what they're really trying to say is like, hey, it's not in the data, it's not in the page data, but it was referenced like when I was trying to mount that thing. Make sure the property is reactive either in the data option or for class-based components by initializing the property. What that's saying is like, make sure it's there. Make sure there's data there. So let's do that. I'm going to go into the view action. I'm going to go where we actually send back the view data for the page. Now this is an action. I'm not going to get too deep into this right now. We've kind of talked about this before. But this is on the back end, right? This is backend code that the server is running. And it's going to return name, John Langston. So that's going to be available in our page data. Now what happens if I go back here and I refresh the page?
It still won't work.
Right. It's not going to work.
To relist the server.
Exactly. Because I made a backend change. So I will relift the server, refresh the page, and there it is. So our front end is completely dynamic at this point, right? But, I mean, technically it's still hard-coded on the back end. All right, next. We've talked about these wigglies, this curly brace notation that's provided by Vue.js. Let's talk about this kind of notation with a little colon in front. So this is how you get dynamic data into arbitrary HTML text, right? Or like into this part, the part between tags. But sometimes you need dynamic data elsewhere. So maybe I'm going to have a link. All right, so I'm going to go to maybe like omfgdogs.com, view amazing content. Okay. It's static, and there it goes. That's a static URL. If we wanted that to be dynamic, how would we go about that? Colon, because this is taking it literally. This is saying, hey, like literally make that the href. Like if I inspect this element, that's literally what's there. A href equals our website. But if I put this colon in front, it's saying, hey, don't take the stuff between the double quotes literally. Instead, interpret it as an expression, like an Excel formula. So what happens if I was to try this? It's gonna give me an error. And the reason it's giving me an error is because I didn't write an expression, right?
Okay.
I just put some weird, that's not a valid expression, right?
Yeah.
Like the JavaScript interpreter isn't going to understand how to run that because that's not valid code. Now, if I send in that a string literal, right, a literal string,
Yeah.
that's a valid expression because that's a piece of data. Or I could send in the number 4, not that that would take me anywhere particularly good. Or I could send in true or false. I could send in these values that are recognized by our programming language, but I can't send in random characters like HTTPS, whatever. Like, if I'm going to be doing that, I got to put it between quotes. This is actually not the most common thing in the world, right? Like, why would you write that? You would just write it without the colon. Well, a lot of times what this is used for is for a variable. So maybe you have a variable called name, for example. Now, this is a weird URL, right? But just because that's a variable we already have on the page.
Yeah.
And I refresh the page. It says href equals John Langston. So the href is not name like that. It's only like that if I put these extra quotes, making it a string literal. So we could make it so that you can change what URL that button goes to, right? Maybe we have this thing called some URL. We started off pointed at, we'll use all the big internet companies here. So we'll start with Google, right? So open dynamic URL from a variable. You can see that's going to take me to google.com. Now, if I want to change that, I could have like another button that's like, and I'm just going to do this in line, quick and dirty. Okay, so I'll say some URL. Well, no, we'll just send you to omfgdogs. Where else would you want to go? Okay, so there's my button. Change where the other button goes, and you can see it change to omfgdogs. So that's the deal with this. But up until now, we haven't really talked about what's happening behind the scenes. And what's happening behind the scenes in both of these cases is Vue is evaluating whatever's between these curly braces, between the double quotes here and here. So let's take a step away from the coding for a second. Like, y'all remember seeing stuff like this in like algebra class? So that's an equation, right? And so that an equation is something that has some value on one side and another value on the other side, and then there's some like relation. Now an expression would be one side of the equal sign. Like 20 would be an expression, 4x would be an expression. An equation is this thing that evaluates to true or false. In the world of middle school or high school algebra, anyways. Expression, we're talking about something like on one of the other sides of this equal sign that is something, right? And it's got to be something that can be evaluated. So like you can evaluate 4x, and if you don't know what x is, it's not going to work, right? Similarly, I could put my favorite expression for x. What are we going to get? In JavaScript, you have to put a time symbol. But we're still going to get an error because x is not defined. So you try to evaluate this expression, and you cannot because this is a free variable. This variable isn't defined. I can't tell you what 4 times x is unless I know what x is. So the only thing we can really do is provide the value for that variable so that this expression can actually be evaluated. Whenever you hear about an expression in Vue or any of these languages that, and really in Excel too, right? I mean, anything that like processes formulas. So we talked about how the initial state can be set from 3 different places. It's not always in the page script, it's in the page. And it can come from Sails locals, which is the server. It can come from data, this thing up here, which is just like hard-coded initial data. Or it can come from the beforeMount function. We talked about what an expression is, how it kind of fits into our world, and how it's the same as a math expression you might have seen in school, but different than a mathematical equation. We've talked about the difference between static and dynamic HTML. And then we reviewed what's going on behind the scenes when you use the curly braces in Vue and when you do the colon prefix HTML attributes in Vue. All right, that's pretty much what I wanted to go over today.